I was born in 1925 in Newark, New Jersey, on Lake Street, very close to Branch Brook Park. And my mom and dad moved to Bloomfield, New Jersey when I was still very, very young. As a matter of fact, I remember them putting me in a crib in the front bedroom when we moved to Bloomfield, believe it or not. And that's where I was raised. At the age of 8, when I was 8, my mother passed away. She had cancer. She had breast cancer. My grandmother, my mother's mom, also had breast cancer. My mom had breast cancer. My dad's sister had breast cancer. So I felt that I was the perfect candidate for breast cancer. And so it was. So I consider myself very lucky because I've survived. I'm now in my early 80s, almost mid 80s, and I would say it's about probably over 20 years. I can't really remember the exact date. But I can remember, believe it or not, being in the crib, and it seemed to me it was white and they had iron bars. They didn't have wooden bars. And then my mom passed away when I was 8. She had cancer. And my father's sister, Frances, they actually didn't call her Frances, they called her Ancy because her nieces had trouble saying Frances, and somehow or other it ended up being Ancy. So Ancy came to live with us, and she raised my brother and I. Just had the one brother who was 2 years older. And went to Sacred Heart. It was a private Catholic school. We're a Catholic family, and had a lot of relatives that were involved, very much so, because I had 2 cousins that were nuns and a cousin that was a Monsignor, and eventually became the Archdeacon of the Newark Diocese. So I think they were bound and determined to have me be a nun, but I don't think that was for me. But anyhow, a year after my mother passed away, I was skating, and I fell and I broke my leg. I broke the femur and rushed to the hospital. That was in September, and I believe it was even before school started. And I was in the hospital for 4 months, September, October, November, December. I left the hospital Christmas Eve day, and I had 4 operations on my leg, mainly because after they set the bone the first time, they found that one leg was shorter than the other. So they had to have a consultation with a specialist, and he recommended breaking the leg again and resetting it. So it was traction and one thing and another. But anyhow, I got through that all right. I walked with a slight limp, but then eventually it straightened out. So naturally, I didn't even consider skating again. But one afternoon, a friend of mine, girlfriend, said that they were going roller skating, and would I like to go? And I said yes, but I don't dare roller skate. So we went to a little skating rink called Prospect, and I went in, and they had music. It was, I guess, in those days they were 78, maybe 78s, I believe, and they had records going, and people were just going around in circles, and I thought, gee, this is really something. I've never seen anything like this. So the second time they went, I told my aunt and father I was going to the movies. I lied. And I kept going, and I kept going, and I saw people in the center doing all sorts of things, and I thought, this going around in the circle is not for me. I want to see what's going on in the center. So I went to the center, and they were doing figure eights and serpentines and spins, and I said, this is for me. So somehow or other, I got up the nerve to go in and say, could you show me what you're doing? Because I would like to learn to do that. and I started doing the figure eights. And then, I don't know, maybe a year went by, I can't remember, and I found out that they were opening a skating club in Montclair, New Jersey. So of course I went to Montclair. Oh my gosh, it was unbelievable. I walked in, it was huge, and they had live music, they had an organist. And they had people doing dances. And I thought, my gosh, I've got to learn to do that. So eventually I started doing dance steps, getting in the center, learning spins, learning to do jumps. And then of course they had a little skating show, and I did my first solo to the music Nola. I don't know if you're familiar with Nola, but I did a simple little routine, and that was that, and I continued to skate. Now this is all during high school. And when I went to home ec, everything I made had to do with skating. It was a skating dress or a skating skirt. In my senior year, the home ec teacher said to me, Mary, if you don't make something other than a skating skirt or a skating dress, I'm not going to pass you in home ec. So I made a skirt. Of course, when I got it home, I cut it off and turned it into a skating skirt. So that I skated 8 days a week. 8 days a week.
Okay.
I don't want to sound like I really am talking about myself too much, but that's what it's about. I know.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, just are we on? I can't remember what preceded this, but my mother died when I was 8 years old. And at that time, I was staying with my grandfather's brother, Uncle Frank, and his 2 sisters. They were maiden aunts. None of them were married, and he also had a daughter, Genevieve. So I stayed there, and I believe I slept with Genevieve. She had a great big double bed.
Stop.
My mother became very, very ill, and I believe I was told that she had cancer. And I knew that my grandmother, my mother's mother, had died of cancer. And I don't remember my grandmother. The only thing that I can remember about my grandmother was when I went to see her, she was in bed. And that's all I remember of my grandmother. So when my mother became very, very ill, my father's sister, Auntie, came to take care of my mother. I think my brother must have stayed at home, and I stayed with my Uncle Frank, my grandfather's brother, and the 3 maiden aunts. At that time, we were going to the Sacred Heart School in Bloomfield. I mean, it was very, very far from home. A long walk to school, and my brother and I would walk to school. So when my mother was very, very sick, instead of going home, I would walk home from school to Uncle Frank's. And one afternoon, I had just gotten home from school, and I was sitting in the living room, and Aunt Genevieve, even though she was my cousin, she was older than... They're going home.
Going the other way.
Aunt
One afternoon. Pick up with that.
One afternoon, I had walked home from...
You didn't grow up in Bloomfield?
Oh yeah, he lived in
But I
Bloomfield.
thought you said it was a long haul to Bloomfield.
Well, the
Oh,
walk.
you went to stay with. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We went to Sacred Heart School from Jefferson Avenue,
I
which
see.
was a big, big, long
Okay,
walk.
okay.
And I would say Uncle Frank was probably midway,
Okay.
but
Now
off
I
of
understand.
Bloomfield Avenue.
So pick up with the one afternoon. Hold on.
One afternoon, I walked home from Sacred Heart School to my Uncle Frank's where I was staying because my mother was so sick. And I believe my brother did stay at home. And she walked into the living room and she said, Mary, your mother just died. We need to go upstairs and say the rosary. So we went upstairs to her bedroom and we knelt by the bed, and I got out my rosary and she got out her rosaries, and we knelt there and said the rosary. And that was it. No other word. No other word about my mother's death. She didn't embrace me. I didn't cry. I didn't know what to do. I was so stunned. So I think 8 years old. I'm only 8 years old. Well, in those days, they didn't go to funeral parlors. The mortician would come and do the embalming and so forth, and the casket that people were laid out, they called it laid out, in their living room. So I was taken to my home, which was also in Bloomfield, and I walked in. I can't remember who took me, whether it was my Uncle Frank. Somebody obviously took me because I was driven. And I walked into the living room, and I only can remember there were women sitting around. And I walked in, and I wasn't quite in the middle of the living room, but I was standing there. I didn't know what to do. And I looked over, and I saw the casket. And somebody said, "You need to go over there and see your mother." So I walked over, and there was a kneeling, I guess you would call it a little kneeling bench or whatever. And I knelt down, and I couldn't look at her face. I could not look at her face. The only thing I could look at were her hands. And wrapped around, she had on an orchid dress. I remember the orchid dress. And the prayer beads were a deep, deep purple. They were beautiful. And that's all I could look at were her hands. And then I knelt there, and I honestly can't remember whether I prayed. I was just so stunned. And I didn't know how long I should stay there. Should I stay there for a long period of time? Or should I stay there kneeling in front of my dead mother a short time? From what I can recall, I didn't stay a very long time. And then I got up and I walked over, and somebody said, "You can go out now. You can go out and play if you want." And I went out, and I can remember my neighbor, Jean Atno, she came over, and I don't know whether we played hopscotch or what we did, but that's all I can remember of that day. I did not go to the funeral. The only thing I can remember, when I came home and got into my own bed, I can remember lying down and saying, "I'm never going to die." I remember saying, "I'm never going to die." So I guess a few days after that, I came downstairs, and Nancy was at the kitchen sink preparing something. And I looked up at her and I said, "Are you my new mother?" And she said, "No, I'm not your mother." She said, "I'm your aunt." But she said, "I promised your mother." "I promised your mother that I would raise you and your brother." And she did.
Where was George through all this?
He was living at home. He was on.
Was he of support to you, or?
We never talked about it. You didn't talk about things like that in those days.
Not even as adults?
Nobody ever talked about it.
What?